Welcome everyone, my name is Faulkner. I'm the online event coordinator for Staff Development for Educators, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today for Differentiated Instruction, What Not to Do, Grades 3 through 12 with Betty Hollis. Before we start, there are a few things you should know. To allow for Betty to be heard clearly, we do place the attendees on mute. Please use the questions text box on your screen throughout the webinar to ask any questions. These will be used for our Q&A period at the end of the presentation. Most audio and video problems you might experience during the presentation can be solved by closing any other programs and applications you might have open on your computer. The session is being recorded, and assuming no technical difficulties, you'll receive a link to the archive within 48 hours. And finally, at the end of today's presentation, you'll see a short survey, and by completing that survey, you do assist us in providing future complimentary webinars. Now, a little bit about SDE. At SDE, we believe educators have the most important job in the world. That's why it's our mission to empower pre-K through 12 educators across the country with sustained professional development solutions that are not only research-based and rigorous, but also practical, innovative, and fun. Our goal is to help you create environments that prepare your students for the evolving demands of the 21st century. We believe together we can create extraordinary classrooms. We're pleased to have Betty Hollis joining us for today's webinar. Betty knows what works in today's classrooms because she's been there. A former Teacher of the Year, she has more than 25 years of experience as a teacher and principal. As a respected presenter on educational topics, she's known for her enthusiasm, her sense of humor, and her wealth of ideas for bringing new energy and learning to the classroom. Betty's an experienced teacher trainer who has worked with thousands of educators all around the world. She's an author or co-author of numerous publications and best-selling books, including Differentiated Instruction, Different Strategies for Different Learners. Welcome, Betty. At this point, I'm going to turn it on all over to you.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon or morning or whatever it is, wherever you are. I am Betty, and I'm coming to you from Houston, just north of the Houston area where I live. I am a native Texan, and so for some of you, I may talk funny. Now, you need to know I don't know I talk funny, but I get kidded about it when I leave Texas. So for those of you that aren't Texans, you need to know I am bilingual. I can speak Southern and Hick at the same time. Let's get started with our session today. We're going to talk today about differentiating instruction, what not to do. Now, when you look at this model, we could say this is probably the traditional teaching model, or the model that we have used, and we really use it still a lot today. We know that we are supposed to reach all of our students, not just those in the middle, right? We've got strugglers in our room, we've got advanced kids, and everything in between. We know we're supposed to differentiate to meet all our students' needs, and we want to do that. That's where our hearts are. However, that's easier said than done. When you think about differentiation, you see, it's not a program, it's not a recipe. It's more a way of thinking about teaching and learning. So the problem is that makes it a little bit harder to wrap our arms around, a little bit harder to put into place in our classrooms. So in our brief time together today, I'm going to give you 3 rules to break. Don't you love it? An educator giving you 3 rules to break. Meaning that if we can break these rules in our classrooms, these things that we should not do to successfully differentiate, if we can begin to break them, we're going to come a long way in helping us differentiate more effectively. Now, here it is, number 1 rule. The rule is teach, 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 and then assess, okay? We want to break that rule. We want to break that rule. But why do we even follow this rule anyway? Teach, 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 and then assess. It's because we live very busy, hurried lives as educators. It's kind of like a hamster on a wheel. The bell's going to ring. We got this to get done. The test is in a month, whatever it is. And so we end up falling into the habit of planning by activities and teach, teach, teach. Oh, yes, and then assess. We're going to break it. We're going to break that rule. So how do you break it? How do you break that rule? The first thing you have to ask, the very first thing, I don't care if you're different, I don't care about any of it. The first thing is, where are we going? What that means is always focus on the learning. You see, in other words, what's the goal? When math ends tomorrow, what is it you want your learners to be able to know or be able to do? What's the learning goal? Okay, we always start with that. But then the next thing we ask is, who are our learners? Who are our learners? We have to know our students. Well, what is it I'm supposed to know about my students? Well, in the differentiated classroom, students differ in three main ways. They differ in their readiness for what you're teaching. They differ in what they're interested in. And they differ in how they learn, or call their learning profile. Okay? So after I know the results, I know my learning goal, then I want to make sure I know my learners. Okay? How in the world do I make sure I know my learners? I have to actively use formal and informal pre and formative assessment to guide what I do in the classroom. Now, you know, assessment is not a synonym for a test. You know that. What is assessment? It's gathering information. And in classroom-based assessment, it's gathering information to shape your instruction. So to successfully differentiate, the rule we want to always break is, instead of teach, 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 then assess. Teach, 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 give the unit test. Teach, 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 give the spelling test. Teach, teach, teach. No, we want to start with assessment. After we know the learning goal, where are we going? Our next question is, where are they now? Okay. Now, because of our limited time today, I want to focus in on one of these differences. I want to talk to you a minute about those readiness differences, because this is really the biggest bang for your buck in a differentiated classroom. Now, readiness, why am I using the term readiness? Because readiness is not ability. It doesn't mean, what is this kid's IQ? No, no, no. If differentiation is a mindset, if I focus on ability, you know what I have a tendency to do? I have a tendency to lock my kids in ability boxes, and I don't want to do that, because readiness can vary in the classroom. So what does it mean? Look at the second bullet. It means given a specific set of learning goals, the unit on weather, the math unit, whatever it is, where is that student in readiness? You may have students who missed something significant from last year. So if you just start teaching, those kids could be lost. You could have kids that already know it, they could teach it. And if you don't assess first, those kids run the risk of not being challenged. Now, readiness is not meant to pigeonhole a student and keep him there. You know, when I was in school, we had the bluebirds, the redbirds, the buzzards, and a few droppings, right? And you stayed like that all year, and everybody knew what group you were in, and all the parents knew what group you were in. No, 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 no. You see, readiness can vary. Now, when you differentiate in your classroom for readiness, your goal is to make each student's task a little bit too hard. Now, if that sounds kind of funny to you, just remember the brain only learns when it's being moderately challenged, and we have to reach a bit, okay? A key with differentiating for readiness is all students are working toward the same goal, but with different levels of complexity, different levels of difficulty, and different levels of scaffolding. In other words, differentiating does not mean different standards for different students. That's not what it means. It means, here's our standard. What do I need to do to differentiate for how my students learn, where they are in the learning curve, so that they can all get there? What's the point? You know, sometimes we think, oh my gosh, I've got enough to do. Now I've got to do this. Think about it this way. If you as a teacher spend the time and energy to get to know your kids' readiness, and you differentiate for that, you know what's going to happen? There'll be more growth and achievement, and that's what we want. If you as a teacher get to know your students and what they're interested in, what do they like, dislike, hobbies, that kind of stuff, and I build that into my lessons, it helps motivate them. Another learning difference is what we call learning profile. If I as a teacher get to know how my students learn, and I differentiate for that, I'll get more efficient learning. Like the student that I sometimes use the example of the student that I observed when I was a principal that was the only one in the room up and walking around and reading his writing. It was fourth grade in Texas, and in fact, our students took the writing STAR test today. Today was a writing test in fourth grade in Texas. And I was watching a writing lesson one day in a classroom, and this fourth grader was up walking around reading, whisper reading his writing. Everyone else was seated. But it was the weirdest thing because every once in a while he would stop. And then he'd read a little bit more and he'd shrug his shoulders. And then he'll read a little bit more and he'd jump. I asked the teacher later on, I said, what was he doing? She said, oh my gosh, he's such a kinesthetic learner that he was doing a walk around edit. He was stopping on a period, shrugging his shoulders on a question mark, and jumping on an exclamation mark. I said, you've got to be kidding. What does it do on a comma? She said, he rocks. And I got tickled. I thought, oh, commas in a series, rock, rock, rock. Okay. But the point I'm making with that, here's a teacher who took some time and energy to know how this student learns. And probably it didn't take a lot of time and energy because if he's kinesthetic, he's probably one of those ones taking in-class field trips, right? But what did this teacher do? Offered this student a different pathway to edit his writing. And she got more efficient learning, okay? So readiness, interest, and learning profile, those are the ways our students differ. And as a teacher, I want to assess, gather information, you see, before I start teaching. Now let's go back to this whole readiness thing. What do we do? In other words, how do I break this rule then and get to know my students? Well, once I've assessed, you see, then I know the readiness, then what do? Well, one of the rules, rule number 2 that we've kind of lived by, is sometimes we give our students assignments that are not what we call respectful, okay? When we're talking about readiness in your classroom, we want to make sure assignments are respectful. Now, see, this can trip us up because we need to define what we mean by respectful. What does that mean? What is an assignment that's respectful? Well, when we specifically match students to tasks that are respectful, one of the ways we can do it is through the use of what we call tiered assignments. T-I-E-R-E-D, not tiered like T-E-A-R, like crying, no. Tiered assignments. You've probably heard of tiered assignments. It's a fancy name for a strategy. It's a fancy name for a planning strategy for you, the teacher. In other words, once you know your learning goal, you know where you're going. Once you know where your students are in readiness, then what you can do is build in scaffolds into lessons or assignments where every student is working at respectfully challenging tasks. Okay? Again, we're focusing on the goal. We're just building in different scaffolds so that all students are working on respectfully challenging tasks. So if we want to really hone in and define respectful, okay, that means the assignment is clearly focused on the learning goal. So see, this is just a good thing, you know, to kind of think about your own classroom and think about something you're going to ask your students to maybe be involved in tomorrow in language arts. And think about it a minute. Am I asking this one group of students, whatever it is they're going to be involved in, is it furthering their mastery of the learning goal? If it isn't, don't do it. I was in a 5th grade classroom in another state. Oh, this has been a number of years ago. And some students were studying fossils, and they were cutting out dinosaur parts and using brads and making dinosaurs. And I asked the students, I said, oh, what are you doing? And they looked at me like I was an idiot. You know, it's kind of obvious what we're doing here. And they said, we're making dinosaurs. And I said, oh, why? And they said, because our teacher told us. But you see, they were confused about the learning goal. I was confused about the learning goal. And you know, I love this story because I was talking to the teacher later on, and She said, you know, I'm a brand new teacher and I'm on a 5th grade team, and this is a unit they've done for a long time, and they told me this is what we should be doing. She said, but I wondered about that too. She said, I wondered what the learning goal was. She said, it seemed to me like an activity, you see. So I said, good for you. I said, you go with that gut. Make sure that go and evaluate and say, is this assignment focused on the learning goal? Now, another thing that makes a task respectful is when we change the assignment and not the workload. In other words, we don't want to say, oh, you can do math, yay. Well, everybody's doing 20 problems, you do 50. No, 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 that's just more work. As you design tiered activities, you look at them. Let's say you've got 2 different things going on, okay? Make sure they're equally fun and engaging, that kids would be okay with it. Okay? I don't want to be the kid working on a 5-paragraph essay and I look over and you're playing a game. Okay? Make them equally fun and engaging. And make sure your activities pretty much have the same time commitments. So let's see if we can find out and decide about a respectful activity. Teacher B is assigning math homework. Some of her students are still struggling to master converting fractions to decimals. Some understand, and some are fairly proficient. Because she knows it's going to take longer for some students to complete the problems, she decides to assign 10 problems to struggling students, 20 problems to on grade level, and 30 to advanced. Respectful or not? No, 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 no. That's just more or less work. Teacher A is helping students learn about simple machines and their use in the real world. For most students, this is a fairly new topic. She does have a few students, however, who studied this in depth last year in the gifted pull class. When she assigns practice activities, she's going to ask each experienced student to work in a small group with students who are new to the topic so they can help those who are not quite as advanced. She thinks that will help advanced students too, because students learn so much by teaching students. Now this one's kind of tricky. We want to stretch a little bit our thinking on this. You know, I know a practice that certainly can be used in your classroom is when you have some students teach and help other students. That's fine. But we don't want to do that all the time. You see, in tiered assignments, it's very diagnostic. We're trying to get that just right now assignment for a student. So sometimes if we rely too much on advanced learners helping other learners, those advanced learners tend to begin to resent it. Okay? So I would say on this one, a better thing might be to have a specific respectful assignment geared exactly to those more advanced students. So what might that look like? Well, let's look at a Common Core standard. Determine and clarify the meaning of unknown words. After doing assessment, okay, after doing assessment, some of the students were right where they needed to be. Okay, so this was a good challenge. It kind of stretched them a little. These kids were going to work to make connections among key vocabulary terms. And the connected words would be identified as well as short phrases explaining the connection between the terms and the topic. Might look kind of like this. Students have to make the connections, they have to explain it. But what if you have some students that, well, you know, they're not right there, more early readiness, need something a little less complex. But again, we're still working on the meaning of unknown words. These students are going to complete a closed paragraph using content vocabulary correctly in context. So everybody's working on the goal, okay? However, I've just adjusted the complexity. I've scaffolded a little bit. And the last rule to break that a lot of times really gets us is when we do not plan for students when they say, I'm through, I'm done, now what do I do? We got to break that rule. We got to carefully plan for what happens, especially if you're working with a small group and other students start to finish. Okay? Because when the management breaks down, we have a tendency to say, well, this differentiation is not going to work with this year's sixth graders, maybe next year. Okay? How do you break this rule? How do you break rule number 3 of not planning for when students are through, what do? In differentiation, there is a term, it's called anchor activities. Anchor activities answer the question, okay, what are my students going to do when they finish? So I want you to think about anchor activities as more ongoing assignments that students can work on independently throughout a unit, a grading period, or longer. They need to be meaningful and tied to the curriculum, not busy work. I sometimes tell the story of my early years of teaching, and this was back before most of you were born, and we used to have these machines in our workrooms called mimeograph machines, and you'd turn this wheel and you'd make copies with purple ink, and the purple ink would get all over you. Anyway, I had some students in math that were advanced, and I didn't know what to do with them because I had all these others that, you know, were really struggling. So I got this idea. I just went and got old math workbooks, and I made what I call packets. I made packets off of that mimeograph machine and gave them to those advanced kids. That's busy work. That's not meaningful, you see. When we design anchor activities, we don't want something that students can just finish in 3 seconds and go on to the next thing. You know, anchor activities are supposed to be something kids would enjoy doing, where they've got some involvement in it, where maybe they get some choice in it. For example, I'm just going to give you one example of an anchor activity. Many of you know this writing strategy. You can use it as an anchor. The raft writing assignment, which gives the student everything they need to write: their role, their audience, their format, and their topic. Those of you that know the raft writing format know that it is great to have students be able to write across the content areas. They can write in math in any content area using a raft. The R is the role of the writer. Who are you? Usually they're no longer the 5th grader in your class. They take on a different role. The A is their audience, the F is the format, and the T is the topic. So for example, here's some raft writing assignments. We're studying punctuation in 8th grade. Instead of giving kids a worksheet they can finish in 3 seconds, what if all my students became semicolons, writing to another middle school student a diary entry, and the topic is, I wish you really understood where I belong. You could look across and see some other raft assignments. So the point would be, if we've had a unit we've already studied, okay, why not set up a raft chart? Kids already know the content, okay? You want them to be able to work on this independently. Teach them how to do rafts. Let them select maybe a raft assignment that they want to work on, okay? Choice will help motivate them. So this is just one example of something that could be used as an anchor activity. Here is a raft that was done by a student in a math class, where the student was the fraction writing to a decimal, a love letter, and the topic is number comparison. Dear Decimal, I've admired you for as long as I can remember. I envy your petite silhouette, though I can mean the same thing as you when you appear at the math club as .72 and I need to be 72 over 100. Everyone looks at you and I'm left in your shadow. Affectionately, the fuller figured fraction. Raft writing is lots of examples of raft on the internet for you to look at. No, you don't have to use it as an anchor. It is a great writing strategy. I'm just saying, you start seeing it now as a strategy for differentiation, because teachers can differentiate raft assignments. Plus, you could also use it as an anchor activity. So now that we've spent a few minutes talking about rules to break, let's use that and have some new rules to follow. New rules to follow. You know, one of the things I thought about when I thought about doing this webinar for only around 25 or so minutes, differentiation is such a big topic, and it's you know, it is hard to wrap your arms around, and it can be overwhelming. So what we're trying to do here is see if we can get it down to just 3 things. 3 things that if you can begin to work on these 3 things, you really will set up the ability to be a lot more successful as you differentiate instruction. So my new rules are, instead of teach, 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 and then assess, remember, assessment drives that instruction. And I know you know it, we know it, but we get away from doing it. And did you know that classroom-based assessment, what you do day in and day out to know where your students are in the learning, that's gonna help them more than any benchmark, anything you can give them. It's your day-to-day knowing where they are and making adjustments as you need to as they march toward that learning goal. Another thing is just to begin to look at those assignments you're giving students. In other words, are they respectful? Are they focused on the learning goal? You know, are kids going to be okay with them? Those kinds of things will really help you challenge students at that appropriate level. And the last thing I want you to keep in mind is the whole classroom management. Because without the classroom management, we have a tendency to throw our hands up in the air and begin to give up on differentiation. So we need a plan for when students say, I'm through, now what do I do? Anchor activities are the answer, and they need to be carefully taught. There has to be procedures and routines for those. And you know, students can help suggest anchor activities as well. And that really gives them some buy-in. So 3 new rules, revisit these rules each and every day. And remember, all of you that are listening today are differentiating your instruction. All good teachers differentiate. You can't spend a day with a bunch of 3rd graders or 4th graders or 8th graders or any group of students without doing some differentiation. All we want to do is just take more steps in our journey to learn how to successfully reach all of our students. So I'm going to turn this over to Faulkner, who maybe has some questions or something. Faulkner?
Well, let me, I haven't seen any questions come through yet, so I'm just going to give a minute to let anybody who does have any last questions or might have some questions submit them through that window on their screen. And while we're waiting to see if we get any of those, I'm going to, I would like to thank everybody for attending today. And what we'd like to do is offer you a 10% discount off SDE PD resources, events, and on-site training by using the promo code W033016 before April 30th. You might be interested in saving 10% and joining Betty at our Read, Write, Math, and More conference in Orlando or our national conference on DI in Las Vegas. Both are happening this July. And actually the DI conference is joined with about 5 or 6, I've lost track now, other conferences happening at the same time. So you can join us there with about 6,000 other educators for just an incredible week of learning. And to keep in mind, Betty's always excited to bring her knowledge to your school or district for custom training. And for more information about PD events, training, or resources, give us a shout at 877-388-2054 or visit us at sde.com. And please do remember to follow us via social media on Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest under the username SDE4Educators with the number 4. Now, and let me take a look. I've got my thing closed up here. I do have a question from Julie, Betty, and she was wondering, do you suggest grading anchor activities?
Oh, that's a great question. No, I do not suggest grading anchor activities. Anchor activities are not meant to add paperwork and grading burdens to you, the teacher. Now, do kids need a product? Yes. Do they need to be accountable? Yes. However, we can wean them off of thinking, I've always got to get a grade. You know, you can hold students accountable for work that they do in your room and not always have to give that grade. What could you do instead? You could do spot checks. You could set up a point system. You can conference, you can have students do, have a rubric, have product descriptors where students check off, have students keep a log of when they're working on anchor activities. In other words, think of things you can do so that you don't feel like you've got to pick up everything and grade it. Because remember, The anchor activities are things where kids already know the content. You know, you've studied this. Why is that important? Because you're working with a student or a small group of students. You don't want kids coming up to you and asking you 16,000 questions. In other words, anchor activities, let's say you've already done that unit on weather. It's done, it's over. Kids have had their unit, everything. Well, perhaps the anchor activity is now built around that weather unit, but it's going to be in greater depth. It's going to be manipulating it in a different way, like maybe doing raft riding around it, etc. So the answer to your question is no. If you start thinking you're going to have to grade all this stuff, you won't do it. No. So great question. Thank you. And you know, like this summer when we're talking about anchor activities in Orlando or Vegas, some of those sessions, we would spend a lot more time on these kinds of things. That's a great question. And normally, you know, I would be able to have told you all that. But hopefully you'll be able to come this summer and we can dive into it a lot more. Thank you for your question, Julie.
All right, I've got one more question. Someone was asking, where can they find information on tiered assignments?
Okay, great question again. Tiered assignments. Now, this is not the same as RTI, response to intervention, and this is the name of a planning strategy, tiered assignments. And the good news is it's pretty well known in the world of differentiation. So just by Googling it, you can find lots of examples of tiered assignments on the internet. Just like another thing, you can find lots of examples of anchor activities on the internet because it's a pretty, you know, commonly accepted definition of things kids can do that are meaningful while, you know, you work with other students. But back to tiered assignments, look on the internet for some of them, but see, today we've all kind of stretched our brains a little bit because I challenge you when you look at those tiered assignments to remember what we've talked about today. See if they're respectful. Give them the respectful test because some of the ones I've seen, I don't know, I'm thinking a teacher might get pushback because you look at them and you think, oh my gosh, this was going to be a heck of a lot more fun. Kids are going to want to be doing that instead of this, you see? And that's a normal thing. As teachers, we start designing these, you know, and it just takes practice. So I would say look at the examples. Some of them are great, but, you know, just be your own judge and look and apply that respectful criteria and see what you think. But yes, you can find lots of examples.
All right. I think that gives us the questions we've got so far. It looks like we might have a few more coming in, but we are pretty much out of time right now. And what I'll do is I will actually get those questions to Betty, and she can go ahead and turn that around. And when we have the archive for the webinar, what we'll do is on SDE.com, we'll include the full Q&A on there as well. So if we didn't get your question, we will still answer it, and it'll be posted on there with the archive. I want to thank Betty for joining us today, and I hope everybody enjoyed today's presentation and that everybody has a great rest of the day. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.